3. September 2012. Medellin witnessed an act that seemed written by the irony of fate. A 69-year-old woman was leaving a butcher shop in the Belém neighborhood when two motorcyclists approached. The passenger got off, aimed without hesitation, and fired twice at her head. There were no words, no warnings, only silence and gunpowder. Thus fell Griselda Blanco, the pioneer of international drug trafficking, the woman who had sown terror across 2 continents and who, decades earlier, had turned motorcycle assassinations into her personal trademark. She died a victim of her own invention, but to understand how a girl from Colombia's poorest neighborhoods came to be known as the Godmother, the Black Widow, the Queen of Cocaine, it is necessary to go back to the beginning, to the childhood of one of the most ruthless criminal figures in history. Griselda Blanco was born in 1943 Polegada, Cartagena, although her destiny was shaped in the outskirts of Medellin. She grew up amid misery, violence, and neglect. Her mother, Ana Lucia Restrepo, could barely sustain a home battered by poverty and abuse. From an early age, Griselda learned that the world offered neither tenderness nor compassion. Her character was forged in necessity and the instinct to survive. While other girls played, she roamed the most dangerous alleys, watching, learning, absorbing the harshness of the streets as an early school of life. Her gaze, those who knew her said, held an inexplicable coldness, for a child a chill, that foreshadowed what was to come. According to popular legend, at the age of 11 she committed her first murder, the kidnapping of a wealthy boy that ended with the victim's death when the ransom went unpaid. It was never proven in official documents, but the myth spread like wildfire and sealed her reputation forever. Truth or fiction, that story was enough to define her. Griselda knew no fear, even as a child. During adolescence, she plunged fully into common crime thefts, fraud, prostitution, smuggling. Each step took her further from ordinary life and closer to a world where crime was not an accident, but a chosen path. Even within the universe of thieves, swindlers, and smugglers, Griselda was not just another one. She stood out not only for her audacity, but for a natural intelligence that allowed her to measure every word, calculate every silence, and choose the exact moment to act. She had an innate talent for manipulation, for attracting loyalty, and at the same time instilling a fear that kept everyone within her orbit. Along the way, she met Carlos Trujillo, her first husband, and the father of 3 of her children. Together, they took the leap toward more ambitious crimes. But while he saw Griselda as a submissive wife, she was already weaving her own plan. What began as small-scale smuggling soon evolved into a much larger operation, directed with a firm hand from the shadows by Griselda herself. By the late 1960s, she made a decision that would change her destiny, to emigrate to the United States. Her destination was New York, a turbulent city, but full of opportunities for those who knew how to seize them. There, among the growing Latino community, she found the perfect ground to expand her business. While many traffickers still focused on marijuana or heroin, Griselda bet on a substance that was beginning to gain ground: cocaine. White, compact, easy to transport, addictive, and increasingly sought after by the American elite and middle classes. She had discovered a gold mine. She quickly built a distribution network with almost military precision. Human mules who carried drugs inside their bodies, shipments hidden in everyday products, alternate routes, false identities. Where others improvised, she created a system. She wasn't just a trafficker, she was founding an organizational model. But that rise did not go unnoticed. In 1975, a federal operation dismantled part of her structure in New York. Arrest warrants were issued, but Griselda already understood a key rule in her world. Survival wasn't about strength, it was about being more elusive than everyone else. Before falling into the hands of justice, she fled. Her new destination was Miami. The city was still a tourist paradise, but within a few years it would become the nerve center of drug trafficking, and Griselda Blanco was one of those responsible for that transformation. In Florida, she didn't just find partners, she found the perfect stage to impose her law. While other traffickers negotiated, she eliminated. While others sought alliances, she sent hitmen. She quickly became the most feared figure in the underworld. Griselda accepted no mistakes, forgave no betrayals or disobedience. It didn't matter whether the culprit was a rival, a partner, or even a lover. The consequence was always the same: death. In Miami, fear had a name, and that name was Griselda Blanco. She ordered dozens of murders, many of them in broad daylight, as if violence were part of the landscape. Witnesses claimed her hand never trembled, and that she even seemed to enjoy the chaos. For her, death was not an extreme measure, it was a language. A vital tool to sustain the empire she was building. With every corpse, her power grew, and with it, her fortune. It is estimated that she amassed hundreds of millions of dollars. She lived surrounded by mansions, luxury cars, jewelry, furs, and gold watches. But that world of luxury stood on a minefield of enemies. The DEA, the FBI, rival cartels in Colombia, betrayed former partners, even members of her own organization. Everyone wanted her gone. Everyone conspired to see her fall. Even so, she remained at the top, unbreakable, ruthless, lethal. Across the continent, she was no longer known merely as a trafficker. She was the Godmother. A woman who inspired both respect and terror in equal measure, who had broken the rules of an era dominated by men. Griselda didn't ask for permission. She imposed herself, and she did it with blood. What in the 1,970 seconds had been a tropical paradise soon turned into a battlefield. Miami began to run red, and behind many of those murders lay her invisible signature. The cocaine shipments arrived from Colombia with near-surgical precision. The money flowed in millions. But it wasn't just trafficking. Griselda was building an empire. She hired young Colombians with no future, willing to kill for a few $1,000s. Under her command, they applied a new style of execution. Hitmen on motorcycles, helmets concealing their faces, firing without stopping. A quick, anonymous, and lethal method. A way of killing that, over time, became the hallmark of the cartels, and it all began with her. Griselda not only controlled the routes, she dictated the rules. No one trafficked without her authorization. No one crossed her territories. No one touched her people. Anyone who dared to do so disappeared. Bodies in cars, in alleys, on beaches, some with clear messages, others nameless. Every death was a reminder. Griselda ruled, and weakness had no place. While other kingpins acted discreetly, she flaunted her power openly. She bought mansions, threw extravagant parties, and paraded through nightclubs, surrounded by armed bodyguards. She wore furs and diamonds with a cold smile, daring anyone to speak aloud what they knew, but no one dared, because with Griselda, speaking meant dying. Her brutality knew no bounds. She had rivals murdered in front of their families. Others were caught in their beds. Even those closest to her weren't safe. One of her husbands, Alberto Bravo, was shot dead after an argument over money. According to several reports, it was Griselda herself who pulled the trigger. In her world, love, loyalty, and life itself all had an expiration date. Griselda Blanco feared nothing. Not the law, not her enemies, not even God. But her violence wasn't confined to the streets, she brought it home. She was a mother, but a feared one. She raised her children within the same criminal universe she had created. From an early age, they learned to obey without question, to trust no one, to survive in a world where betrayal meant death. One of them bore a name that clearly revealed Griselda's vision of power: Michael Corleone Blanco, named after the character from The Godfather. It wasn't an innocent tribute, it was a statement. For Griselda, Life itself was shaped by crime. Meanwhile, Miami was turning into a battlefield. The drug war reached levels never seen before, and at the center of that storm was her. The media called her the Black Widow for the coldness with which she eliminated lovers and enemies. Others dubbed her the Cocaine Godmother. The truth was that her influence had grown so much that even the Colombian cartels began to fear her. Some sought to make pacts with her. Others plotted her elimination. The U.S. authorities, for their part, had already placed her name among the most wanted. The DEA intensified its operations, multiplied arrests, and tightened the net. But Griselda kept moving shrewdly, changing houses, identities, and partners. She always seemed one step ahead. However, something began to break. Her inner circle started to show cracks. Some hitmen, exhausted or frightened, sought deals with justice. Others simply disappeared. The pressure mounted, and the woman who had ruled with an iron fist for years began to see enemies everywhere. Paranoia became routine. She ordered executions based only on suspicion. She punished supposed disloyalties without proof. Her decisions became erratic, impulsive. Little by little, her empire began to crumble from within. And yet, her legend only grew. She was no longer just a drug trafficker. She was a living myth, a figure wrapped in an almost unreal aura. She had crossed every line, destroyed every barrier, and still remained free. Her downfall didn't come with a spectacular operation or a cinematic chase. It was simpler, more human. A betrayal from within. One of her men, a close ally facing a long sentence, decided to save himself by turning her in. There were too many corpses, too many debts to settle. His testimony was the thread that allowed authorities to connect the scattered pieces, shipments, bank movements, murders, and all the paths led to a single name: Griselda Blanco. The fall of Griselda Blanco wasn't the climax of a movie-like pursuit. It was, in fact, a quiet ending for someone who had lived for years on the edge of the law. In 1985, the authorities managed to capture her in California. There were no gunfights, no large-scale chases. The woman who had turned Miami into a war zone fell into the hands of justice in anonymity, as if the weight of her own story had already caught up with her before she was handcuffed. She was only 42, but her face bore the marks of decades of accumulated violence. The media impact was immediate. Newspapers and newscasts portrayed her as the mastermind behind a wave of blood that had defined a generation. The charges were severe drug trafficking, conspiracy, homicide. The prosecution claimed to have witnesses, recordings, documents. Yet even in court, Griselda never appeared vulnerable. With chilling composure, she faced each hearing without apology and without admitting a thing. The testimonies presented against her were shocking. They spoke of parties where murders were planned as casually as others arrange a dinner, of assassination orders given with the same calm as ordering a cup of coffee. Even so, the homicide charges failed. There was no direct evidence. The final verdict was for drug trafficking, 15 years in prison. For many, a ridiculous sentence compared to the crimes attributed to her. But in the underworld, even behind bars, her presence still cast a dangerous shadow. Rumors soon multiplied. Some said she still pulled the strings of hidden businesses. Others claimed she was writing her memoirs. The truth was that her name continued to inspire fear. It was as if the myth had survived the woman. The government tried to link her to a particularly atrocious case, the death of a 2-year-old child in a shooting aimed at his father. It was considered one of the cruelest episodes connected to her organization. But the accusation fell apart. Witnesses recanted. Testimonies never materialized, and suspicious deaths occurred before the trials. Once again, justice fell short before Griselda's shadow. Meanwhile, the drug trade's landscape was changing. Colombia and Mexico burned in power struggles. New organizations solidified, and the cartels stopped being family clans to become international structures. Griselda, meanwhile, became the past, history, a necessary reference in the origin of it all. In 2004, she was released after nearly 20 years in prison. She returned to Medellin, deported to the same city where she had learned to survive amid poverty and violence. But what she found was a different scene. Enemies, dead or imprisoned, children scattered, and a society that barely remembered her. Of the queen, only the name remained. Griselda Blanco managed to survive hitmen, raids, and the most powerful enemies of her time. But there was one thing she couldn't escape: oblivion. Upon leaving prison and returning to Colombia, she no longer inspired fear. Her name, which in the 1980 seconds had chilled the blood of both police and kingpins alike, now sounded like the faint echo of a bygone era. She returned to Medellin in silence, without the commotion that had once accompanied her every move. The city, transformed by the years, received her without fear or reverence. It was a different metropolis, louder, more modern, that barely remembered the woman who had once imposed her law across 2 continents. Settled in a modest neighborhood, the former cocaine godmother led an almost invisible life. Nothing remained of the mansions, the armies of hitmen, or the lavish parties. Her neighbors saw her as an elderly, quiet woman who rarely left her house. Few knew that this discreet figure had been responsible for one of the bloodiest eras in international drug trafficking. The irony was brutal. The woman who once moved tons of cocaine and ordered dozens of murders now shopped for groceries in the neighborhood like any pensioner. And yet, beneath that apparent normality, an intact instinct persisted. Griselda remained distrustful, cautious, always alert, a woman capable of hiding a gun in the most ordinary place, just in case death came looking for her. The rumors never completely disappeared. There was talk of contacts who still protected her, of a small network in Medellin that answered to her name, even of attempts by her youngest son to revive part of the family legacy. But the truth was far harsher. Griselda was alone. Her fortune had vanished among lawyers, bribes, and betrayals. Her former allies preferred to keep their distance, not out of fear of her reprisals, but of the memory of what she represented. She spent her final years as a shadow of herself, a ghost within her own legend. The press had forgotten her. The DEA and authorities now pursued other names. An organized crime, always evolving, saw her as a worn-out myth, a relic of a violent past. But the world of drug trafficking has one inexorable rule: debts are never left unpaid. And although time had erased her empire, someone, somewhere, was still waiting for the moment to settle accounts. On the 3rd of September 2012, Medellin once again heard an echo of its own past. That afternoon, Griselda Blanco left her home to do something ordinary, to buy meat at a butcher shop in the Belén neighborhood. No one imagined it would be her final trip. As she waited in line, 2 men on a motorcycle stopped in front of the place. The passenger got off, walked calmly toward her, and shot her twice in the head. He said nothing, gave no warning. It was quick, cold, calculated, the same style she had imposed decades earlier on the streets of Miami. She died instantly, fell to the ground without redemption or ceremony. The butcher, unaware of everything, was the last to see her alive. The circle had closed with brutal irony. Griselda Blanco died a victim of her own invention. The woman who had introduced motorcycle assassinations as a tool of crime was executed by a hitman who was likely not even born when she reigned. Her death was no media spectacle, no high-profile police operation. There were no helicopters, no cameras, no historic trials, only a body on the ground and a pool of blood on an ordinary sidewalk. Her end did not merely mark the death of a woman. It represented the close of an era. Griselda was not just a drug trafficker, she was the symbol of what unrestrained ambition and limitless cruelty can create and destroy. And as happens with symbols, her shadow did not vanish with her body. After the assassination, Medellin did not erupt into wars or vengeance. The criminal world already had new bosses, new structures, new codes, but her name lingered, floating like a warning, the memory of what a single, unscrupulous mind can provoke. However, the story did not end there. Griselda left behind more than corpses and lost fortunes. She left heirs. She had 4 children, 3 with Carlos Trujillo and 1 with her 3rd husband, Darío Sepúlveda. They grew up surrounded by extreme luxury and constant fear, among weapons, bodyguards, and promises of loyalty as fragile as betrayals disguised as affection. One of them, Darío, was murdered while still young, a victim of the revenge wars that haunted the family. But the most public figure would be the youngest, Michael Corleone Blanco, a name chosen with full intent, inspired by the Godfather's protagonist. For his mother, it wasn't just a cinematic tribute, it was the confirmation of the destiny she had imagined for him. Not an ordinary man, not a free citizen, but an heir, a prince of crime. Michael Blanco grew up between 2 worlds, the United States and Colombia. From childhood, he lived under the shadow of his mother's criminal empire. Protected by the network of power she had built, he witnessed her rise and also her downfall. The capture, the prison, the exile, the loneliness. He saw that crown, once indestructible, crack until it disappeared. In later interviews, he would sum it up in one sentence that carries the weight of a curse. I didn't choose this life. I was born into it. And though he has tried to reinvent himself outside of crime, Griselda's shadow follows him with every step. After his mother's release, Michael sought to capitalize on the Blanco name in a different arena, the legal market. He founded the brand Pure Blanco, a blend of street fashion, narco culture, and digital business. He appeared on television, gave interviews, and presented himself as an entrepreneur. But beyond the clothes and marketing, what he sold was a sanitized, yet unmistakably dark, version of the legacy he inherited. For some, Michael is a tragic figure, a son marked from birth by an inheritance impossible to reject. For others, he is an opportunist who chose to commercially exploit his mother's memory. Either way, no one can deny that his life is the inevitable sequel to the story written in blood and fire by Griselda Blanco. The impact of that woman remains palpable. She was the first to prove that drug trafficking was not a man's world, that a woman could be just as calculating, as ruthless, and as merciless as any kingpin. Griselda didn't just eliminate rivals, she eliminated husbands, friends, partners, anyone who ceased to be useful. And she did so without remorse. Beyond the killings, she left behind something even more disturbing, a criminal model. She introduced structures that remain in place today, imposed styles of violence that later became standard practice among cartels, and designed smuggling methods that are still being refined. She wasn't seeking equality, she was seeking absolute control, and she achieved it. Years after her death, her figure continues to divide opinions. For some, she is a kind of anti-heroine, the woman who triumphed in a man's world. For others, she represents the most brutal form of power without limits. For most, her story stands as a warning of what happens when ambition merges with impunity. Griselda didn't vanish with her last breath. Her mark remained engraved in the neighborhoods she ruled, in the lives she destroyed, in the routes she opened, and in the popular culture she helped shape. Global drug trafficking changed after her. Her empire crumbled, but the lessons she left behind live on in those who watched her reign. Because Griselda didn't teach with words, she taught with blood. Every order she gave was short, direct, sharp. Her violence was neither impulsive nor chaotic. It was strategic, symbolic. She didn't kill out of necessity, but to send messages. And in her world, those messages were worth more than any word. Griselda Blanco's power didn't depend on shouting or speeches. Her presence alone was enough. A cold stare, the silence around her, and the reputation that preceded her were sufficient to keep anyone in line. In her world, there were no second chances. Disobedience wasn't corrected, it was punished by death. For her, violence wasn't an exceptional measure, it was part of her strategy. Many of the murders attributed to her didn't respond to direct threats. They were calculated investments. One death served to send a message to hundreds. Each corpse became a reminder of who held control. It was her signature, a silent seal that commanded respect without her needing to be present. Her army of hitmen, young men without a future, pulled from poverty and neglect, saw her as a motherly figure of power, though a distorted one. She gave them money, protection, and purpose. But that loyalty was always conditional. Serve or die. There were no middle grounds. Even those who enjoyed a certain closeness knew they were never safe. Griselda trusted neither affection nor emotional bonds. She believed only in absolute control. Not even her intimate relationships escaped that logic. Husbands, lovers, partners, anyone could become a target once they stopped being useful. The most remembered example was that of Alberto Bravo, her second husband. An argument over money ended in a shootout in broad daylight. According to reports, Griselda fired first and killed him instantly. Then she simply got into a car and drove away. She didn't run. She didn't hide, because fear had no place in her understanding of power. In drug trafficking, many killed to survive. She killed to rule. For Griselda, murder was a mechanism of control, a method for managing her empire. The most disturbing thing was the ease with which she made those decisions. Talking about killing was as casual to her as discussing business. She showed no remorse, felt no guilt. It was simply part of the job. That coldness extended even into her family life. Her children grew up surrounded by weapons, suitcases full of money, and conversations about death and betrayal. There was no room for bedtime stories or tenderness. What they received were warnings, training, and silence. A former bodyguard described her with a chilling phrase. Griselda was like a calm bomb. She could seem peaceful, but if something exploded around her, she exploded harder. Pride was one of Griselda Blanco's driving forces, an excessive, almost pathological pride. She tolerated no challenges, not even a glance she perceived as disrespectful. Her response was often disproportionate. Not only the traitor fell, but also his family, his friends, anyone who could one day pose a threat. Her nickname, the Black Widow, was not born from journalists' imagination. It reflected her way of living and killing. Like the spider that devours the male after mating, Griselda eliminated those closest to her when they ceased to be useful. And yet, there were those who followed her with devotion. In a world where everyone was disposable, being under her shadow was, for some, a privilege, a mark of status. Being part of her circle meant prestige, but also living with the knowledge that any day could be the last. Drug trafficking was never just a business of drugs. It was always about power, symbols, and fear. And Griselda understood that before anyone else. That's why she didn't need tons of cocaine to maintain her authority. Her name was enough. In the streets of Miami, when someone died in brutal circumstances, when bursts of gunfire shattered the calm, there was no need to investigate further. People whispered just one phrase. That was the lady. And that was enough. Most saw her as a ruthless, bloodthirsty criminal, a killer, even of her own. But what few realized was that behind that violence lay something even more dangerous, a business mind far ahead of its time. In the 1970s, drug trafficking in Colombia was still rudimentary. Small groups moved modest loads, routes were improvised, and the risk of loss was constant. Griselda thought differently. She didn't want to join the existing system. She decided to create a new one. She was a pioneer in building a transnational network between Colombia and the United States. To achieve it, she structured a logistical system that combined customs contacts, fake bank accounts, front companies, and meticulously designed routes. Her operations did not rely solely on human mules carrying cocaine inside their bodies. She also employed seamstresses who altered clothing, technicians who modified household appliances, and carpenters who adapted furniture and suitcases to hide drugs. Each shipment worked like a perfectly synchronized production line, where every link had a precise role. And at the center of it all was her commanding with the discipline of a general. In Griselda Blanco's machinery, there was no room for failure. A delay, a loss, or an indiscretion was paid for with one's life. Her system operated with the precision of a clock. Each part fulfilled its function, and any mistake was eliminated at the root. Unlike many of her contemporaries, she quickly understood where the real market was. She didn't target marginal consumers or street addicts. Her goal was the elite executives, bankers, Hollywood artists, professionals with money, and a need to appear successful. Thanks to that strategy, cocaine became the drug of ostentation. Expensive, glamorous, discreet in appearance, but devastating in effect. That understanding of demand fueled the growth of her empire. For every gram she managed to smuggle into the United States, she multiplied her profits. For every death she ordered, she secured millions in business. But Griselda's true legacy wasn't her temporary fortune. It was the criminal model she built, one that would be replicated for decades. Without offices, contracts, or laws, she managed to create a system with hierarchies, clear objectives, logistical structures, and tight control over every link. For many investigators, without Blanco's pragmatic vision, international drug trafficking would have taken much longer to become the global industry it did. Even the major Colombian cartels that followed Cali and Medellin learned by observing her methods. Because Griselda wasn't only a ruthless killer, she was also a strategist who thought in business terms. She diversified routes, multiplied contacts, managed her cash flow with the discipline of an executive overseeing investments. And when something failed, there were no meetings, no warnings, there were funerals. She was a pioneer in using violence as a business tool. She didn't kill on impulse, she killed to keep the machine running. For her, murder was part of the operating cost. If someone talked too much, stole, or showed hesitation, they simply disappeared. At the height of her power, her earnings were estimated between $80 and $100 million per month. It's believed she controlled up to 80% of the cocaine entering through South Florida. And she did it from the shadows, without speeches, without interviews, without propaganda. Only fear, efficiency, and results. In that sense, she represented the opposite of what would come later. Modern drug trafficking would become media-driven, loud, almost theatrical. Griselda sought neither fame nor recognition. Her only goal was control. For her, power was not a spectacle, it was a duty, and her duty was to ensure that nothing moved without her permission. Her impact was so profound that even after her downfall, many of her tactics remained in place. Clandestine air transport, connections with corrupt officials, the use of women in key logistical roles, and the compartmentalization of information. Strategies that, decades later, still form the foundation of global drug trafficking. Griselda's empire was built on a simple rule. No one had the full picture of the business. Each person knew only a fragment of the system. That compartmentalization, inspired by the logic of secrecy, allowed her to create a professionalized structure that would later be imitated and refined by generations of traffickers. She was the first to show that crime could be organized like a business, with hierarchies, processes, and discipline. The difference was that in her structure, firings weren't signed with letters but with bullets. Her legacy wasn't only the spilled blood, but the method a disturbing lesson on how chaos can become order when structured by someone cold enough. That lesson remains alive. Every time a shipment crosses borders, every time a cartel expands into new territories, there is a trace of Griselda Blanco in the DNA of those operations. Her figure stopped being just a name in DA files or court records. Over time, she became an icon. Her shadow crossed the boundaries of crime and seeped into popular culture. Songs, films, series, documentaries. Her story became just another product, rewritten again and again from different perspectives. The ruthless criminal, the mother, the fugitive, the businesswoman, the system's victim, or its predator. Each version captured a fragment, but none managed to contain her entirely. Because Griselda was no longer just a person, she was a myth. One of the first works to rekindle global interest in her figure was the documentary Cocaine Cowboys, which portrayed her as a key player in Miami's transformation during the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds. Then came TV adaptations, movies, and portrayals by famous actresses who added layers of fiction to an already incredible story. Her name also became embedded in urban music. In rap, reggaeton, and trap, it began to be used as a synonym for respect, power, and authority. Lyrics referenced the Godmother as a title of honor, comparing her to the greatest kingpins in history. In neighborhoods and recording studios, phrases like, "I'm like Griselda," or "the Godmother of the block," were repeated. Crime, luxury, and ambition intertwined, and her name became a symbol of status. The way popular culture absorbed the figure of Griselda Blanco is unsettling. Over time, her story stopped being told through the brutality of her crimes and began to be filtered through the lens of style and power. Instead of talking about the victims, people talk about her cleverness. Instead of pointing out the magnitude of the violence she unleashed, they highlight her commanding personality. Thus, she ended up placed on the same pedestal as fictional characters like Tony Montana or Michael Corleone. Film and television gave her an aura of glamour, turning her into an almost literary figure. The problem is that this romanticized view tends to obscure the essential truth: the thousands of lives broken by her ambition. Why such fascination? Perhaps because her story connects with a dark impulse in society: the attraction to absolute power. The idea of someone who, in a world where most control nothing, seems to control everything. That perverse magnetism transforms violence into a symbol and, worse, into aspiration. Griselda Blanco thus became an ambiguous emblem. For some, she is a case study in crime. For others, a cultural phenomenon. And for certain audiences, even a model to follow. But the reality is clear. She was a woman who turned violence into a system and left a mark that neither prison nor death could erase. Here arises an uncomfortable question. Is it possible to tell her story without glorifying her? Because yes, she was a pioneer, but not in feminism or empowerment, as is sometimes claimed. She was a pioneer in turning crime into a business, in professionalizing violence, in proving that gender does not limit the capacity for cruelty, and that, more than admiration, should provoke reflection. Series, documentaries, and songs will continue to recreate her myth, but the facts don't change, the victims don't return, the pain doesn't fade, and the scars remain open. Griselda Blanco was not an intriguing fictional character. She was a real machine of death. And the fact that she is remembered today as a legend reveals an uncomfortable truth. Society doesn't always choose whom to forget, but whom to turn into an icon, even if that icon is built upon corpses. Griselda Blanco has been dead for more than a decade, yet her shadow remains. In drug trafficking, the kingpins disappear, but the methods survive. Bullets can silence a voice, but they cannot erase ideas. And Griselda's ideas became embedded in the very marrow of modern cartels. She left no disciples, she left a mold, a model that others copied, adapted, and perfected over time. What, in the 1,970 seconds, was an innovation, the compartmentalization of cells, the use of silence as a weapon, violence as a message, is today part of the basic manual of any criminal organization. The human mules, the transport hidden in everyday objects, the shell companies for laundering money, everything she designed through a mix of cunning and cruelty was later professionalized and adopted by cartels across the continent. Mexican groups, heirs to the vacuum left by Colombia in the 1,990 seconds, replicated many of her methods. They understood, as she did, that true power doesn't always lie in the amount of guns or drugs, but in the ability to inspire fear without ever appearing. That was always her specialty. Silent terror. You didn't have to see her to know she was behind a crime. Suspicion, rumor, fear, that was enough. Today's leaders have also learned that visibility is a risk. Today's kingpins hide, delegate, and sign orders that are never written down. This model of the invisible criminal finds one of its earliest prototypes in Griselda Blanco. But her legacy was not only logistical, it was also philosophical. For her, power was absolute or it didn't exist. There was no room for doubt or mercy. That worldview, marked by total disregard for human life, eventually became law for many who came after. And even though her name no longer appears in headlines, her way of thinking lives on in clandestine offices, in encrypted conversations, in blood-sealed pacts. In Colombia, for years, investigators studied her as the ultimate example of individualist drug trafficking. One that depended not on family or clan, but on the will of a single person capable of defying everyone and winning. Griselda Blanco was an anomaly in her time, a woman who, without sponsors or a powerful clan behind her, carved out her own path in a man's world and dominated it on her terms. Her life transcended crime. It was analyzed in universities, discussed in books, and studied by criminologists, sociologists, and journalists. What she did was not ordinary. It was, for better or worse, a historic fact. But one cannot speak of legacy without speaking of consequences. Her reign left behind a trail of pain that didn't end with her death. Decades later, entire families still carry the fear. Survivors never learn to trust again. And many who were once part of her circle partners, hitmen, lovers, ended up dead, exiled, or imprisoned. The machine she built spared no one, not even the loyal. Not even her children could escape. Heirs to her name, they grew up trapped in an invisible prison, that of their mother's memory. Some tried to rebuild their lives. Others remained caught in the same cycle. Michael Corleone Blanco, the only one to speak openly, summed it up in one haunting sentence. My childhood was like living in a movie, but without a happy ending. Because when your mother is a queen of crime, normality is an unattainable luxury. The name Blanco became a paradox, a mark of power in the underworld, but a curse everywhere else. It was a key that opened dangerous doors and closed all the others. That, too, was her legacy, the impossibility of escaping the past. Her story reflects more than the life of a woman. It is the mirror of a society that, for years, ignored how cocaine destroyed lives while enriching a few. A system that allowed someone armed only with ambition and cruelty to bring entire cities to their knees. And a culture that, instead of burying that memory, constantly revives it between fascination, morbid curiosity, and selective forgetting. Griselda Blanco doesn't need to be alive to remain present. Her shadow appears in every drug corridor, crossing a border, in every silent score settling, in every organization that chooses terror over respect. That is her true legacy, a world where crime doesn't need a face to keep ruling. In the end, her story ended like that of so many who once had everything, alone, aged, watching the empire she built with blood crumble into ashes. Her name, which once inspired fear during her glory days, was reduced to a faint memory echoing through Medellin. The woman who once controlled routes between continents, who moved millions of dollars, and who made Miami tremble, died in 2012 coldly executed on an ordinary street, without an army, without power, without a crown. She was 69. The death of Griselda Blanco was a cruel reflection of her own life, without warning, without mercy, without trial. A hitman on a motorcycle, 2 bullets to the head, the same method she had popularized decades earlier. For some, it was irony. For others, poetic justice. But the truth is that her murder solved nothing. It didn't erase the pain, didn't bring back the victims, didn't heal the wounds. Her end was merely the final period in a story written in blood for decades. After nearly 20 years in US prisons, she had returned to Medellin to live in the shadows, but the past never stays still. Sooner or later, it collects its debts, and in her case, it did so with the same coldness with which she once ruled. There were no honors, No lavish funerals, only silence. Even in death, her name continued to inspire fear. What Griselda Blanco leaves behind is more than a criminal biography. It is an uncomfortable question. How could a single person cause so much chaos? How was it possible for her to go so far without being stopped in time? Perhaps because Griselda wasn't an isolated accident, but the product of an unequal, corrupt system that chose to look away while cocaine built fortunes and destroyed societies. She wasn't an exception, but a reflection, a reminder of what happens when power concentrates without limits, when ambition knows no restraint, when human life loses its worth. Was she the worst? Some will say yes. Others will say she was simply the first to do it with such coldness in a man's world. What's certain is that her story transcends her life. It became a warning, an echo, a symbol, because sometimes crime doesn't create monsters, it simply reveals them. And Griselda Blanco was exactly that. An uncomfortable mirror of what happens when money becomes God, death becomes routine, and morality becomes an obstacle. Her story ends here, but the questions it leaves remain open. If you enjoyed this documentary, please subscribe, leave a like, and share it so that more people can discover these real stories that seem straight out of fiction. Thank you for staying until the end, and remember, the history of crime is full of shadows, and there are many more still to tell.